What's the weirdest thing you've overheard on a plane? I was flying solo into Orlando. The woman next to me was so excited about her new boyfriend's boat and was going on and on about how excited she was for this trip. I nodded and put my headphones in, and about 1 minute later, she grabbed the cord on my headphone and pulled it out of my ear so she could blather on about it. I asked her if she had lost her mother mind. Story 2. Not so much what he said, but I sat next to this fully grown man that was playing Plants vs. Zombies the whole 3-hour flight with incredible enthusiasm. Every time a plant got eaten or he killed a difficult zombie, he'd jump in his seat, pump his fist, and aggressively whisper, "Years, years, skirt 'em, yes." Story 3. I sat in front of a kid, 12, 13, and his older sister, who I assume was his guardian. It was a cross-country flight, and the kid was casually talking about how he had never flown before, and he is looking forward to it. He seemed likely on the spectrum a bit. It is pretty wholesome so far. Then the plane starts to move, and he instantly freaks all the way out, screaming, "We are all going to die. Let me off this plane. It's a coffin. You're all going to die. It's going to be a fireball," etc. The stewardess comes by and tries to calm him down. The sister is talking to him in English and Spanish, trying to get him to relax, telling him he's embarrassing her. She's never taking him to Puerto Rico if he keeps acting like this, etc. The guy in front of me turns around and loudly offers the kid Xanax. Finally, the hero of the story, a big southern black lady, says, "James," not his name, "Honey, I'm gonna need you to calm down, sweetie, because you're making all the rest of us real nervous now, okay?" Eventually, and for no noticeable reason, the kid relaxes and starts talking about how cool flying is. Like a switch, he starts looking out the window, saying things like, "Wow, the view is really cool. I feel safe now. Everything is okay after all." Audible collective sigh of relief. Where was his sister flying him to? Astronaut camp. I think about him every time I fly. Story 4. Not that weird as such, but when literally about to touch down, a lady got up and started walking urgently towards the bathroom. The cabin crew immediately started saying, "Madam, we're about to land. You have to sit down." The lady responded by screaming in a panic, "I'm gonna shit meself." They allowed her to continue. Story 5. 2 Mormon missionaries trying to convert the sweet, naive man sitting between them the entire flight. Next time on a flight, I got on really buzzed. Sat next to this girl who struck up a conversation with me. She was going to Oregon to join what any reasonable person would notice was a cult. She described the whole thing to me: give up belongings, worship, and work together to build a commune. I, as soberly as I could, told her to just be really careful and that it sounds like a cult, to keep her wits about her, and leave if she felt in any way uncomfortable. Some religious lady in front chimed in and started saying she's just finding her Lord and Savior, and I have no right. Spent the better part of that flight in a really weird fight to save this girl from a cult. I'm sure someone overheard this, and it must have been the weirdest thing they have heard on a flight. IDK. Maybe it was none of my business, and maybe I shouldn't have got into this on a flight, but drunk me felt it was my duty to save her. Comment. I once tried to be nice to 2 missionaries that showed up to my house. I sat outside and talked to them, asking questions for about an hour because I thought people would likely be rude to them. I wanted to be nice. Then they kept sending people to my house over and over again, and they wouldn't leave me alone. I kind of get why people just go no thanks and slam the door in their face. Story 6. Not so grugzing, I overheard, but so grugzing semi-interesting nonetheless. I once went and got sushi with my mom, and I noticed a guy and a girl at another table very clearly on their first date. They were both dressed very nice, a lot of awkward laughter. The guy was being ultra gentlemanly, like pulling her chair out for her. You know, just the usual stuff that tips an observer off that they were still very much getting to know each other and wanting to make a good impression. Fast forward 2.5 years. I was boarding a plane in Atlanta, Georgia, heading to Colorado with my brother to go skiing when I saw the same couple seated near the back of the plane. I was in the row directly in front of them. So when I put my bag up, I turned to them and said, "This is going to be super weird, but did you guys have your first date at insert sushi restaurant?" They both got wide-eyed in shock and laughed and told me that they had in fact had their first date there. I told them I was there that night and just happened to recognize them when I boarded the plane. It was friendly and we chit-chatted for a bit. They were going skiing at the same place we were, so it was cool and all. Day 2 of our trip, my brother and I decided to go to the top of the mountain and take a few of the more advanced slopes down to the bottom. There were maybe a dozen or so people up there, and before taking off, we decided to look at the trail map to make sure we were going to get back to where the shuttle could pick us up without having to hike our gear for 2 miles. About 20 feet away from us, a guy got down on one knee and proposed to his girlfriend, and everyone clapped as she jumped up and down with excitement and said, "Yes!" They took off their helmets and goggles to kiss, and it was the same freaking couple. I literally was there for their first date, met them for the first time on a plane, purely by chance because I was sitting in front of them, and was present when he proposed to her. I assume they're still married because at the rate we're going, I'm probably going to run into them again if one of them decides to file for divorce. Story 7. I was flying to Seattle from Atlanta, and there was a baby crying for the majority of the flight. The parents were doing their best, and it really was not their fault. Just a crafty situation. About halfway to Seattle, the man seated in front of the baby snapped and started screaming at the baby and his parents, cursing at them, saying how they're awful parents and he's gonna beat them all, including the baby, to a pulp when they land. A flight attendant tried to ask the guy to calm down, and he said he would also beat her up. The pilot had to come on and tell everyone to calm down, or else we had to make an early landing. We made it to Seattle, and the guy ended up having to be tackled by 4 cops at the gate because he was trying to run away after being approached by them. Story 8. 2 guys next to me gloating to each other about how they beat their wife. Then they went on to discuss what would be a reasonable cause. Do not did this. Like if they cheated or stole from you or so grugzing. They were giggling like school children. They definitely did not realize I spoke Spanish and probably thought I couldn't understand them. Story 9. I was sitting next to a dad and his daughter who was about 5. He was super cool and was chatting away while his daughter started talking to me. She was so sweet and bubbly and gave way too much information to me. She said so grugzing along the lines of, I went to my grandma and grandpa's house and they're married. I wish my dad would marry my mom, but they can't talk to each other, but I always wish they were married like my grandma and grandpa. Her dad would have been horrified, and I was just sad. Comment, when my dad was on hospice care, the nurse was being introduced to our family. Had just gotten done telling her that I didn't usually live in the house, but was staying for a few months to help out my folks. Nurse turns to my 6U niece and says, do you live here too? And my niece just matter-of-factly says, no, but we're eating dinner here pretty much every day until dies. I will treasure the look on that nurse's face forever. Story 10. There was this kid was behind me that kept telling her dad she lost her tooth, and the dad was disgruntledly trying to find it. And some guy nearby said, hey kid, I hear if you lose your tooth on a plane, the tooth fairy gives you $50. To which the dad replied, hey look sweetie, the tooth fairy decided to sit next to us on the plane. Story 11. A guy coming home early to bust a cheating wife. He was on the phone with a friend family who told him the other guy was at his house, they didn't expect him back until the next week. Happened to me. I got rebooked on an earlier flight and came home about 5 hours earlier than expected. Wasn't my wife yet, just my fiancée. Worked out for the best for me. We both knew it wasn't working out anyway. She then married the guy, and he treated her terribly. Turns out he had a cargo ship of psychological problems he kept well hidden. It took her several years to get the divorce to go through and get their finances untangled because he dragged it out as long as he possibly could. Story 12. I am a pilot for a major airline. Decades ago, I was running for a deadhead flight home and managed to snag the last seat. A mother and young daughter were seated next to me. Halfway through the flight, the mother, seeing my disheveled look after flying all day, asked if I wanted her daughter's PB&J sandwich that she wasn't going to eat. I politely declined, but she insisted. That was the best peanut butter and jelly sandwich I'd ever had. Story 13. This isn't crazy, but it's definitely the most fun I've had on a plane. This guy introduced himself as Caribbean Boy, chatted with nearly everyone on the plane, asked them what their plans were, complimented everyone, then started singing Bob Marley type stuff. He had most of the passengers clapping along. Everyone was smiling. Most charismatic man I ever met. Story 14. Nothing too weird. A couple in their 50s who were all over each other, like tongues in ears, hands in pants, etc. They were busy working out the logistics of their next getaway. They were both cheating on their partners and laughing at how gullible their SOs were believing another business trip would come up so soon. Story 15. I was sitting next to a father with his small child. The child wouldn't stop hopping around until the father said, sit still and be a good boy, or the plane will crash because of you and we will end up dying. Never seen a kid so quiet before. Story 16. Have a buddy who's flown many, many times and is comfortable with it, but he said one time he heard an older, 80s lady talking about how easy it would be for her to sneak a bomb on the plane. She apparently went into detail with her gals about how exactly she would do it. He said he didn't really worry BC. It sounded like she was joking, but it made him uneasy because of how simple she made it sound. Story 17. Before takeoff, after the doors were closed, a kid of about 6/7 years old towards the front of the plane stood up on his seat, faced the rest of the plane, and yelled, "We're all gonna die!" while his parents tried to pull him back down. Story 18. Oh, I got this one. Passenger Fee is struggling to get his luggage into the overhead compartment, and passenger E, seated next to me, starts getting upset. V's carry-on clearly doesn't fit. He speaks up saying to be careful because his luggage is there. Flight attendant comes over and says passenger V needs to check his bag. V grows increasingly disturbed, but it works out. Then V says to the flight attendant, "I'm sorry, it's just that I haven't taken my medication. I get so nervous with all these body bags on board. You know I have body parts in my luggage." Passenger E turns to me and says, "Did you hear that? I just have a laptop in my luggage." Story 19. The lady beside me told me that she was farting a lot, and she didn't care about telling me because she wouldn't see me again. Story 20. A drunk guy shouting Allah Akbar at the top of his voice while waving his carry-on bag around on an overnight flight for a joke. He was immediately arrested when we landed. Story 21. Everyone is boarded and the plane is in the middle of the taxi when a kid about 10 seats up and on the left side, I was on right side, starts crying and screaming at the top of his lungs, "I need to poop," and "I'm going to poop," over and over again until the seatbelt signs came off. I've never seen so many worried faces and the look of panic as the mother picked up the kid and bolted to the toilet. Another story. I was sitting behind this cute toddler and her dad one flight, and while we were landing, she wouldn't sit down. She was turned around in her seat, staring at me. Her dad was calming, telling her to sit down while we land, and she looks me straight in the eyes and goes, "I can't, I'm pooping." Story 22. Sat next to a college guy once who, while drinking some alcoholic beverages, started crying and telling me he killed his best friend in a drunk driving accident because he had good lawyers. He got off with jail time. He was sobbing and drinking. When we landed, I made sure he was not driving. Story 23. Sitting next to a young woman and her boyfriend on a flight about to depart to San Diego. They were going for a romantic getaway, and apparently she decided to find God on the way to the airport. What did that mean? Well, she decided that they weren't having any more sex until he married her. But kissing, hand-holding, and other PG-rated intimacy were perfectly okay. Boyfriend tried his best not to flip out, but you could tell he was very agitated. An hour later, we're in the air, and they're both awkwardly sitting there without saying a word. She gasps and starts crying rather loudly. Apparently, he logged into the plane's Wi-Fi, canceled the hotel, and booked himself a turnaround flight home. Pretty sure they were done as well. Story 24. Two older guys in my row on the way to an academic conference. One of them mentions that the first thing he's doing is attending a lecture on some esoteric physics topic. But before he can even finish the name of the topic, Guy Hash 2 says, "Oh, of course, the effects of co-limited tesseracts on quantum membrane string interactions, or some such physics jargon. Are you familiar with the topic?" Guy Hash 1 gets halfway through saying, "Well, actually, before he is cut off by Guy Hash 2, who says, "Because you see, most people, even in the field, are woefully undereducated in this particular subject," and then proceeds to talk Guy Hash 1's head off for about 10 minutes. Guy Hash 1 just nods and smiles patiently through the whole exchange. At the end of his missive, Guy number 2 says, "So, the lecture is being given by Dr. So-and-so, one of the leaders in the field, an absolute legend. Do you know his work?" And of course, Guy number 1 puts on a very kind but somewhat sheepish look and says, "Actually, I am Professor So-and-so. Your understanding of the field is actually quite good." Guy number 2 turns red as a tomato for a few seconds, but seemed to get over it quickly, and they spent the rest of the flight casually talking shop about theoretical physics. Story 25. Not that crazy, but a fun story. Last December, I was flying from Frankfurt to Chicago and was seated in the absolute last row of the plane, where the staff prepares stuff so you can hear them just chatting with each other. Right before takeoff, I heard one of the flight attendants say to another, "Is that thing still broken? I swear they'll never get around to repairing it," which is not Sagroogsing you want to hear on a flight. The guy next to me was like, "Did you hear that?" looking at me like, "WTF, I hope nothing major is broken." The attendants then said Sagroogsing like, "Well, at least it's not maggots this time," and me and the guy next to me were thoroughly concerned about how this flight would go. After laughing it off, I spent the next 9 hours chatting to this complete stranger about our entire lives, relationships, family drama, etc. We had 4 glasses of wine and decided to watch The Matrix together, making sure to pause whenever the other person paused. I don't think we exchanged names, but if you're out there, guy from Wisconsin living in Italy and teaching English, thanks for the most fun flight I've ever had. Story 26. The absolute mayhem that broke out when the captain announced that we were in fact not gonna get to take off because of night air traffic restrictions at our destination after we had been sitting and waiting in the aircraft for 2 hours already. That entire evening was just a great mess. First, we had to wait for a flight attendant who was called from standby. Then we finally got to board the plane, but apparently, the airline had a severe ground staff shortage, so there was no one to get the luggage onto the plane. When the luggage was there, we didn't have a tow. Then the captain told us we wouldn't get landing clearance at our destination, but that we couldn't deplane either because, well, ground staff shortage, and the only guy who was allowed to attach the jet bridge was busy with other planes. So we sat there for another 2 hours. Absolute horror for the flight attendants, because people were raging and didn't understand that the airline employees, PN the plane, had nothing to do with rescheduling / compensation / or the reasons for this mess in general. I actually kind of enjoyed the whole thing, turned out to become a little adventure. I got to transfer to another airport in the city, spent the night there, and flew out with a better airline the next morning. Paid by the original airline plus cancellation compensation, but man, poor flight attendants. Story 27. Way too late for anyone to see this, and it wasn't so much overheard as said to me. I was flying alone, and this little girl, maybe 5, wandered down the aisle and said hello. I asked where her parents were, and she said they died, and a police officer was flying with her to take her to her aunt. My brain was not able to conjure any response at all apart from, sorry. She asked if she could look out my window, so I moved over to the aisle seat and let her, me continuously looking for a cop that she might be traveling with. She then told me how her parents were driving back from a party last week, and their car got pushed off the road by a truck into a tree. She was quietly crying while telling me this story. Suddenly I hear, "Oh, there you are," from the aisle. There's a woman standing there. The girl says, "Hello, Mommy," and leaves with her. Story 28. There's a bomb on the plane. It's going to go off at insert time here, as the time he said approached. 10, 9, 8. The police were waiting for him when we got there. Story 29. When I was 16, I was taking a flight from Oslo to Stockholm, around 45 minutes. Before liftoff, the guy in front of me, around 30 years old, broke up with his GF who sat next to me. They yelled so much and loudly during that flight, I had the worst headache when we landed. Why not just wait 45 minutes? Story 30. Once I was flying between two Australian cities, and there were a bunch of highly manicured young men sitting in front of me. They looked somewhat familiar, but I couldn't place them. Naturally, I spent the entire flight trying to figure out who they were, mostly by looking between the seats while they were texting their friends. I saw them write a bunch of messages to mates about how much they didn't want to hang out with us, and they just spend all their time in their rooms. It wasn't until we landed, and I walked out into a room of screaming teenage girls, signs and selfies at the ready, that I placed that we'd been sitting directly behind 5 Seconds of Summer, an Australian boy band which was reaching popularity at the time. I can only assume they were texting about the band they were touring with, a little-known outfit called One Direction. Story 31. On an Aegean flight from Athens, and a baby toddler apparently was repeatedly kicking the guy's chair in front of him. The guy got up and was angry, threatened to beat him. The other father yelled back, threatened to press charges, and they were yelling and ready to fight. They had to be separated. The flight continued, and by the end of the trip, they apologized and it was resolved. Story 32. I was on a flight and happened to glance over and see the phone of the guy sitting next to me. He was scrolling TikTok and watched some clip of a girl dancing and revealing clothing. I'm not even convinced the girl in the video was of age, but anyways, this 50-year-old dude just comments, "Yummy," and then keeps scrolling. Story 33. Passenger 1. I can't wait to get there. This party is going to be insane. Passenger 2. Did you hear? Jose said his estranged wife is going to be there. Passenger 1. Why is she estranged? Passenger 2. Because she's strange and he's Mexican. Story 34. On my flight to Denver, a really nice woman sat beside me. We just started chit-chatting about flying and how excited we both are to get to Denver. She asked me why I was going to Denver, and I said because I'm going to see my cousin get married. Then I asked her. She told me she is going so that she can go back to her old childhood home and kill herself. I was shocked and didn't know what to say. She continued on with why. That's the house she was continually beaten in and sexually assaulted by her father, staring at the age 4. She told me how much she's suffered and can't continue on. I just sat there not even realizing I was holding her hand and told her how truly sorry I am for her. She just half smiled and said, "Thank you, and the pain will be over soon." Now, many of you may react or feel in different ways to what I did next. I went and told the flight attendants that I was sitting next to a very suicidal person. I gave them very little detail, but enough to make some action. Upon landing in Den, the flight was met by emergency services. The lady somehow figured it out that they were there for her. She turned cold and numb, said nothing, but walked right to the awaiting ambulance. I hope she is okay. Story 35. Delayed for some issue. I hear banging on what I assume is a luggage door underneath. After several minutes, I hear, "Duck it, we'll fix it in Pittsburgh." Story 36. B3. Duck. Anyway, I watched two people argue if their acid tabs were kicking in via the plane battleship game. C3. Duck me and duck you. Are you getting these texts? When is this flight taking off? Story 37. Sitting on a plane in Chicago, waiting for takeoff. There was a delay, so the guy across the aisle was talking on his phone very loudly. He looked familiar, and was wearing a hat from a company in my hometown. I end up overhearing his entire conversation in which he proceeded to crap talk my brother, whom he indirectly works with. We were over 500 miles from home. He was using full names, details that couldn't be misconstrued. It was hilarious. I wanted to call him out on it, but he looked a lot crazy, so I kept quiet. Story 38. Flying domestic, yes. Two oldish ladies spent the whole flight talking about how ugly my husband is, in French. I guess they assumed no one could speak it. We can. Story 39. A 2-hour domestic argument circling around the man's arrogance and the woman's geitiness they were told before takeoff. If they didn't cut their crap, they'd be kicked off the plane, and they did until about 20 miles after takeoff. Then they were just getting at each other the entire flight. They were going to Croatia to see the man's homeland, as he called it. But I got the impression this was a recent revelation, as she kept correcting him on his own family history. Your grandpa wasn't from Git, he was from... I wanted the plane to crash. Story 40. Ladies and gentlemen, We've been facing some strong headwinds, and it appears we burned up a little asterisk more fuel than we anticipated, so we will be making a diversion to Fiji. This was flying from the US to Australia in a 747. I had seen on the trip map that we had been flying in the wrong direction for like 2+ hours. When we did land, we landed hard, and they told us that because of the landing, we had to sit on the ground with the engines off in Fiji in the summer while technicians looked at the plane. When we were airborne again, our destination was fogged out, and we diverted from Sydney to Melbourne. I don't ever want to spend 26 hours on a plane again. Story 41. Want me to kick his ass? Said by the friend of a man who kept refusing to turn his phone off before takeoff. Pilot had to come back and warn him it was his last chance. The passenger next to him kept telling the FA he had his phone on still. Everything seemed settled, and then randomly toward the end of the flight, the two parties involved decided a fight was in order, and a light brawl occurred somewhere near Las Vegas. Once we landed at LAX, we went right to the gate and they were arrested and taken off the plane. Story 42. I was once next to this young kid, his dad, mom, and I think one other kid. I'm looking at the kid play on his iPad and playing this guitar game when I hear the mom tell the dad, "You cheated on me again?" She starts to hit him, and he completely disregards it, and she says again, "Why did you do it again?" Story 43, cleared to land, any runway, on a United flight on Thanksgiving 2 decades ago, listening to From the Banana Pit after our transcontinental flight had a duck go through an engine at our dawn takeoff from an airport, Sacramento, say, surrounded by wetlands. There was smoke in the cabin, and the pilot had declared an emergency. Ground control didn't respond at first, raising the question of whether the bird had first hit Sogrugzing else and damaged the radio. Postscript. We landed fine, met by emergency equipment, and were towed to the gate. Our flights were auto-rebooked before we could get off the plane. Our re-rebooked flight was direct to our destination region, making up for the later departure, although involving a little more driving in the snow. Story 44? Just happened last week. Our flight crew was definitely not happy, and there were a lot of difficult people on the flight. The vibes were bad before we even took off. As we began our descent, the flight crew just went to the back of the plane and proceeded to do nothing. I was sitting at the very back. They were just hanging out, openly talking about how they were done and couldn't wait to land. And then they made one of the craziest announcements I've ever heard. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be doing the honor system today. Please make sure your neighbors have their seatbelts on and things stowed away. I would say that 90% of the people on the plane had headphones on, or didn't heart it, or ignored it, or didn't speak English. The other 10% were looking around like, what the duck? And then we hit the worst turbulence I've ever experienced while flying. No warning, but asterisk. This crap happens during landing. Asterisk, and tons of people didn't have their seatbelts on. Nothing was stowed. There had been no trash collection. And at least 5 people were in the aisles getting things from overhead, or trying to use the bathroom. These 5 people becoming human-sized projectiles. All the flight crew did was shout from the back of the plane, which, at that point, was probably all they could do. One git was like, "I fly all the time, we aren't even close to landing." He proceeded to open an overhead compartment and immediately get taken out by a bag that had shifted. Anyway, it was a huge ducking mess. Stuff and people were going everywhere for about 5 minutes, and then we landed. And then people just started chaotically grabbing things and trying to rush off the plane, which caused numerous arguments. Kids were screaming, etc. It was by far one of the stupidest, most avoidable things I've ever experienced in my life. A very real OMG, I can't believe I might die with these gits moment. I've also never seen that much trash and general debris all over the inside of a plane before, let alone on an 2-hour flight asterisk. Story 45. I had a seat near the lavatory. Some poor git was in a rush to use it, and once he got inside, it sounded like he fired up a chainsaw, followed by some alarming, gurgling, gushing noises. It took a while for him to come out, but he seemed okay. Story 46. Not so grugzing, I overheard, but a friend was telling me he was on the flight between Stockholm, Thailand, either from 2. And there were 2 old guys openly talking, bragging about all the crap they had done with young boys whilst in Thailand. Story 47. I was in window seat lady next to me, daughter on aisle side. She kept saying, "See, you can see the earth is really flat from up here. No curve at all," etc. It was like she wanted me to go, "Oh wow, you're right, kid. If you think the earth is flat, I don't think you understand gravity enough, but somehow trust a plane." Story 48. All right, I posted this one before on Reddit 9 years ago. This was pre-9/11. Older Southwest planes used to have lounge seating up front where first class would normally be. 2 rows of seating that faced each other, staring directly at a stranger for 4 hours. Awesome. The plane was full in pre-9/11. You could bring a ton of crap on board. 2 good-sized bags, food, a huge purse, etc. The flight attendant went through the aisles trying to get everyone to put their stuff in the overhead. because the floor was filled with everyone's crap. The woman in front of me had a lunch cooler type bag. The attendant asked if there was any liquid in it and the woman said no, so the attendant put it above, over my seat. The lady across from lunch cooler lady had a massive floor-length fox fur coat on her lap, and she was a big woman going on 6 feet and very large, so this coat was huge. The flight attendant tells her it has to go above in the compartment. The woman sort of flips out and goes on, arguing loudly about how this coat costs as much as a car and stuffing it into a small space will ruin it. The flight attendant was on the verge of calling Dad over to settle it, the pilot, when Fur Woman gives in reluctantly. The attendant assures her she will be very careful not to compress it too much. And again, it goes in the compartment over my seat. 30 minutes into the flight, the guy next to me perks up suddenly and asked me, "Did you feel Sogrugzing?" And a second later, I did. Sogrugzing was dripping on us. Looking up, there were lines of fluid all over the button area, and what started as an occasionally drip was now like a drip a second in several places. The attendant came over and searched through the overhead. Lunch cooler lady was the culprit. The bag contained a huge thermos of chicken soup. Lunch cooler woman declared she didn't count it as a liquid earlier because it was in a sealed container. Then out came the coat, completely soaked in chicken soup, and thus began the great stare down of 1999. The two women across form each other on a flight from Maryland to Vegas that had just finished with takeoff. I have never had such a case of the giggles along with a complete stranger in my life. Every time another drip came down, it would start again. Told her, wore chicken soup for a cross-country flight, was worth it for the entertainment value. Story 49. Not exactly overheard, but I had a guy sit next to me on a plane when I was about 14 and he was absolutely sloshed. He even told me he went to just about every bar in the airport before the flight and then let me know all about some wedding he was going to. He even asked me for some of the candy I was eating, but the best part was that he let me know the wedding gift he was bringing was a hummingbird carcass and that he had a machete in his suitcase. It turned out he was in the wrong seat, by the way. The plane had not even taken off and he managed to tell me all this before he was moved. Story 50. Not really overheard, but witnessed. We were late to check in and only got seats in the second to last row. We were flying to an African country from Paris, and my wife and I both don't speak any French. Walking from the front all the way to the back of the plane, we figured that 95% of the people on the plane only spoke French. So when we finally got to our seats in the back, there were 7 policemen, women in the row behind us, surrounding a guy wearing a Hannibal Lecter-type mask and a straight jacket, yelling uncontrollably. We asked the police if there was anything to worry about, and they just said "Sogrugzing" serious in French and didn't care to explain anything. As my wife was visibly uncomfortable, I asked a flight attendant if we could move seats, but the flight was fully booked. Adding to this, when the plane was about to depart and 5 of the policemen, women, suddenly left. So we're left with a crazy dude in a Hannibal Lecter mask and 2 policemen sitting in the row right behind us. All sorts of scenarios were playing through our minds. Are they just going to release this guy into the wild once we land? Is this guy going to pull anything crazy on the flight? Is he going to remember our faces and kill us in our sleep? Mind you, this guy kept screaming and fighting the straitjacket like a maniac. As we took off, the guy immediately stopped screaming. When we reached altitude, someone who saw how uncomfortable we were came to us and told us that the guy was being deported for some minor crimes. Apparently, it's very typical that these guys try anything to stay on the ground, and once they're in the air, they know they've lost their battle. The rest of the flight was quite okay. They even removed his mask and let him eat. They stayed on the plane even after we left, so we didn't see him anymore after. But yeah, that was the craziest ducking flight so far. Story 51. I was on a flight from London to Leeds/Bradford one Friday on a single propeller plane with only a tiny number of seats, sometime back in the 1990s. There were 2 sales guys a couple of seats in front of me who had obviously already had a few drinks and were in full party mode. They kept slapping the air stewardess on the backside and asking for more drinks, which she wasn't giving them as they were too drunk. Then they went into this long and loud discussion about this crazy big sale they had managed to make, which I assume was the reason for their celebrations. I distinctly remember one of them kept repeating this dumb phrase. I was like an angry big bear, and every time he said this, he would growl and rake his hands as if they were bear claws in the air. His colleague would then say, "Yes," and I was there to calm them back down again, and he would do this strange rocking motion with his arms, like he was rocking a baby. As they got more and more animated, they kept getting out of their seats to do their little act, and the poor air stewardess had to come over and ask them to sit down again. Then we hit turbulence. The plane hadn't been exactly stable the entire flight, hence the insistence from the air stewardess that everyone keep in their seats, but the last half an hour was pretty extreme. I actually liked turbulence, so I was loving every minute of it, rising up out my seat, then being pushed back down again as we rose and fell through air pockets. The wings were making some pretty scary noises, but most of the passengers were obviously used to a bit of turbulence. as nobody made too much of a fuss. Apart from the two sales guys, that is. They were crying like babies the whole time. One of them started wailing about all his life's regrets, how he had been a bad husband and cheated on his wife, etc. The other one just kept screaming, "Please let it stop!" over and over. We finally got landed, after being redirected due to the bad weather conditions. Then we had to sit in a coach for a long and awkward journey, with the now pale and subdued sales guys looking as embarrassed as they deserve to. Story 52. Hour-long plane trip from Dothan, Alabama to Atlanta. Sat in front of two guys arguing the validity of demon possession. One believed that it wasn't a possession per se, but merely the devil interfering with your thoughts. The other believed it was an actual demon possession. And he knew people that did exorcisms, which solved the problem. It was a fascinating philosophical discussion. I was entertained for the full hour. The world is different down south. Story 53. I lived in Thailand, and the sex tourism there really can't be overstated. So many ugly old white dudes with young Thai women. Anyway, I was flying from Chiang Mai to Bangkok with an overweight, pasty white guy who I assumed was with a prostitute. They were arguing about money, and I heard him say, "I gave it all to you." Then he started taking out bills and just shoved them in her face. He eventually scoffed and gave me a look like, "Ugh, escorts. What can you do, buddy?" Story 54. OMG, my time to shine. I was on a plane coming back from a work trip. About halfway through the flight home, I start hearing, "God damn it, Larry," and people groaning, etc. Like the whole plane is having a conversation and I'm unaware of what's happening. The person sitting next to me sees my confusion and takes the opportunity to fill me in. Larry is sitting a few rows up from me and is airdropping dick pics to everyone on the plane. The exasperation is because he has done this multiple times during the flight, and he just keeps doing it. So they're trying to call him out very publicly, and he keeps doing it. So much so that the plane has identified exactly who Larry is, and they are continually yelling at him to his face in disgust. And Larry only responds with another pic. It was glorious and terrible. I was laughing when I had to tell my wife the story about what happened on the plane ride on the way home. Story 55. Not that interesting, but I was going through security, and the guy in front of me had this really fancy-looking box that got taken to look at. It went missing at some point, and as I was putting my escorts on, I heard him very stressedly scream, "Where did you put my father's ashes?" Story 56. Listen to a guy on a 3-hour flight try to lure an underage girl, headed for LA, to be a singer, into giving her a ride to her friend's place, that he definitely knew what part of town it was in. I listened to him talk about all his music connections and how he could help her career, and then slowly transition into how he and his wife had an open relationship and how everyone in LA was totally cool with multiple partners. Anyways, long story short, I waited at the end of Jetway when we landed. They walked out. He went to make a phone call, and I walked up to her and said, "Hey, I know this is none of my business, but I have a very bad feeling about the man you've been sitting next to, and I think you should call an Uber. Do not get in his car with him. You don't know him." She looked at me terrified and said, "What do I do?" We called her an Uber. He looked over and gave me an extremely dirty, super creepy look and walked away. I waited until he exited the airport and made sure she got an Uber. Potentially helped make sure an aspiring singer didn't get kidnapped. Story 57. Years ago, I had to fly to Houston for a business trip in the summer. Apologies to anyone from Houston, but Houston is literal hell on earth. Worst city I have ever had to travel to. I could not wait to get the F out of there. So I board my Southwest flight back to Los Angeles, and I am like a 5 in the boarding order. When I get on the plane, the first row aisle seat is available, so I grab it. I sit down, make myself comfortable, put on my headphones, and start scrolling on my phone. We are getting down to the last of the C group, the ill-prepared group of people who forget to check in 24 hours before the flight and then complain that they have to take a middle seat. There is a line of people waiting to find seats when I feel a tap on my shoulder. I look up to see this absolute beast of a man standing over me. No joke, this guy looked like Kimbo Slice. Hell, it could have been him. He was wearing a wife beater and a do-rag on his head. I look up and he motions for me to take off my headphones. He says, "Yo, you're in my seat." I look confused. "I am sorry, what?" Him. "I said you're in my mother duck and seat me." Super confused, looking around at my fellow seatmates like, what the hell? Just then a flight attendant comes up to him. "Can I help you, sir?" Him. "This guy is sitting in my seat." Her. "Sir, there are no assigned seats on Southwest." She looks at his boarding pass. "You are in the C group. You are going to have to find a middle seat that is available." Dude looks at me with a death stare and goes back to find a seat. Midway through the flight, I get up to take a leak, and I see this dude's massive head over all of the other passengers just staring me down like he's going to freaking kill me. As soon as we landed and they opened the door to the plane, I ran like a little git until I was far from the terminal. Story 58. An old couple, like in their 70s on their way to Florida, getting into an argument, and the wife just started bawling out of nowhere. The husband didn't want to buy her a banana tail. She started talking about divorce after the vacation, and he was just laughing. He even said, "You do this every time we get on a plane." He did eventually buy her the gin and tonic, though. Story 59. I was like 9 on a flight to Paris, and halfway through the flight, I really needed to take a crap. But every single bathroom on the plane that I could find was locked, and the ones that weren't had people waiting for it in order. So I decided to wait in line for the next one. I couldn't take it anymore as my ass pipes were about to ducking blow. So I used my small fingers to slide the lock from red to green, and I see some lanky Asian guy jacking off to some anime video on his laptop aiming his banana at the toilet. Man, I was actually traumatized for the longest time, but luckily I got a crap a few minutes later after another one of the restrooms opened up. Story 60. Welp, I did it. I was flying home from Seattle through Vegas in the late 90s. Since it was a last-minute business flight, I was glad for any seat, even the middle seat of the last row. I'm slim, but at 6'3" AC, even slim takes up space. The aisle seat was then taken by a gentleman who was absolutely buffed to the max, completely jacked, and sporting a Klingon insignia ring picked out in diamonds. Oh heck yeah, I'm starting a conversation. He was a firefighter, an IT professional, and on his way to the Star Trek experience. I was a Microsoft subcontractor on my way home from work on Outlook 97. We geeked out for the entire flight, loudly and animatedly talking Star Trek, coding, computers, fire and firefighting, physics, thermodynamics, and everything else. And coming into Vegas, I finally look over at the window seat. A tiny elderly gentleman was practically crawling up the fuselage, trying to get out of the way of the gigantic nerds sitting next to him. I can't imagine what he thought of us. Story 61. I commented another story elsewhere, but I got a good one someone must have overheard. Sat next to this girl on a flight to Florida, and she started talking to me. Turns out she was flying down to get into prawn before she joined the Navy, wanted to live a little before joining the Navy. It was a wild conversation. I told her to be careful and asked her if someone knew exactly where she was going and stuff just in case. They didn't, so she texted her friend the info. Got off the plane and a 40-year-old guy and lady were waiting for her at the luggage drop with camera equipment and were documenting picking her up from the luggage claim. It was really weird. I think they made a documentary about some prone house down there that sounded a lot like the place she was going, but I have no clue if it was. Story 62. Once I was nervous flying on a plane, and I apologized to the man next to me that I might be a little fidgety for that reason. He said, "I know what will make you feel better," and proceeded to show me a video of him playing guitar for a group of deer. It stunned me out of my nerves, to say the least. Story 63. I once was flying back home from Washington, D.C. on a relatively short flight. The woman sitting next to me had a whole bunch of angry, profanity-filled texts and emails open that were written to her ex-husband. I didn't want to be snooping, but when you're sitting on a cramped cabin and can only look at what is in front of you, it's kind of hard to ignore. Story 64. Was on a flight to Manchester during a storm after a long flight from Sea Asia via Saudi. The landing was horrible. The plane smacked into the runway, bounced 2 or 3 times, and started skidding sideways before the pilot finally regained control. I was sitting in the back row. They say that if you're ever scared of flying, look to the flight attendants for reassurance. I don't have a fear of flying, but this landing shook me up. It clearly shook up the cabin crew also. As soon as we were safe, and during the entire taxi to the terminal, the attendants in the galley behind me were having a very audible conversation about your chances of dying in a crash landing. If it crashes when landing, it explodes and we're all dead, was one of the misinformed gems I overheard. Haven't flown with Saudia since. Story 65. Once I was on a plane flying from Michigan to Texas, so it wasn't too long or bad of a flight. Now, I had just finished my first year of college and was about 20. I am alone. Not a lot with me at the time. I am sat at the aisle seat near the back of the plane, a couple beside me. Keep in mind here, I have headphones in, the universal sign of don't talk to me or touch me. Out of the corner of my eye, I see the man, closer to the window, whip his banana out, and she starts getting him. They were quiet, though obvious. Anyway, I think she had a toy in her or Smith, and she started squirming and crap. That's when I feel her hand slap down on my knee and grip it as it looks like she was trying for the seat or armrest. Long story short, that's when I started to question liking girls. Story 66. Stall warning klaxon from the banana pit. A flight out of Fort Myers right before Thanksgiving, the morning after a tropical depression, made landfall about 50 miles north. Plane takes off, rotates, and during the climb out hits a severe downdraft and drops like a stone. Everything loose hits the cabin roof as we pull negative G, plane wallows and recovers. Stall warning going honk, honk, honk. After we reach destination, pilot greeting passengers as they disembark. You know it's been an eventful flight when this happens. And I ask, was that the stall warning I heard? You heard that, did you? How much altitude did we lose? About 500 feet. I'm still picking bits of seat cushion out of my backside colon. Thanks for flying today. Story 67. Once I was flying at night and 90% of passengers were sleeping. Suddenly, stewardess with poker face ran down the aisle with small fire extinguisher in her hands. I think almost nobody noticed, and that made it kind of funny, but it was still scary. She was really running for her life. Story 68. on a long red eye, middle of the night when all the lights were off and 80% of the passengers were sleeping, some girl started screaming. Just a long, high-pitched, blood-curdling yelp jolted me awake and then suddenly stopped. Must have been a night terror or so grugsing, but I was sure we were all going to die. Story 69. A flight attendant that hit on 2 women for the entirety of the flight. Like skipped handing out snacks and drinks, other flight attendants were clearly pissed at him. He performed a couple very subpar magic tricks, gave them free alcohol. The 2 women were clearly not feeling it, but enjoyed the free stuff. Cherry on top was when we started the descent. He pulled out a harmonica and played a little tune for them. Story 70. I was on a short flight and got bumped up to first class for reasons I can't remember, but I didn't really question it. Sat next to 2 very wealthy-looking gentlemen. One was talking about how his friend just told him he had incurable cancer, and then they suddenly both roared with laughter. The second guy said, "So you got him sorted, yeah?" And the first replied, Yeah, I got him sorted straight away." I often think back to that conversation. I wonder if I was missing some context, or if cancer really is just a laughable thing. The very rich can just wipe away like it was a paper cut, while the rest of us have to deal with its harsh realities. Story 71. I was flying home for Thanksgiving one year and sat in a row with 2 people approximately my age who apparently did not know each other, a guy and a girl. The guy was pretty chill and generally seemed like a cool guy to know. The girl had come to the airport several hours early to drink as much as she could because she was terrified of flying. Once service started in the air, she ordered as much alcohol as they would let her have. Still, the conversation was generally good and entertaining, and the 3 of us spent the entire flight chatting away. When the pilot announced we would be arriving soon, she started getting more and more upset, holding both our hands and squeezing like crazy. About 5 minutes before wheels down, she turned to the other guy and said, "Would you just, make out with me until we land? I've got to do so grugsing to take my mind off being in an airplane." He agreed. When we all got off the plane, she went to catch her next flight, and he and I went for the exit, as that was our destination. He and I exchanged some jokes about how weird the situation was and ended up exchanging numbers to hang out sometime, but never really hung out after that. I'm still convinced it was a pretend we don't know each other couple situation, but he told me that was not the case. Not the Story 72. I was just on an international flight, and the dude sitting behind me was talking to another woman. She asked him why he was in Europe, and he said it was for a UN summit, or so grugsing. Then she asked him if there was any good news that came out of that. He just sighed and said, "No." Story 73. There was a man on the opposite side of the aisle a few rows ahead of me. He was wearing an old army jacket and sweating profusely, all the while repeatedly getting up out of his seat and checking into his bag in the overhead compartment. Flying makes me anxious anyway, so this was freaking me out. Then a flight attendant walked up to me and whispered, "Is that guy behaving oddly?" I nodded. "So," she said, "well, keep an eye on him and let me know if he does anything else strange. WTF. Story 74. Ex-flight attendant here. I have stories out the wazoo, but the strangest thing I ever saw was a young man, probably 18, 20, board my flight with a manila folder full of old newspaper clippings and pages. Old, stained yellow from age, 60s, 70s newspapers. He sat in the front row, aircraft left, so I could see him from the galley during the whole flight. He began shuffling through his newspaper clippings and found one with a large ad featuring a man's face on it, and began tearing little pieces of the paper from the edges and eating them. This kid ate, piece by piece, the whole page except the man's face. When he was done, there was just a circle the size of your palm of the man's face left. I watched him open his folder and lift up the stack of pages to reveal a smaller stack of faces he'd eaten around. When I tell you I think about this every day, please believe me. Story 75. So a family friend used to be an airline pilot. In the late 1990s, he was on a flight when the head stewardess came up to the banana pit and informed him that she had heard the word bomb in the cabin. This was, of course, pre-9/11, so security measures weren't nearly what they would come to be, but it was still a potential threat to the aircraft regardless. He confirmed with her that she had no other context other than the word. Dave opts to ask what row the stewardess heard the term from and walked back to talk to the passenger himself. Turns out the one in question was an Indian man with a very thick accent who had just purchased a Palm Pilot and was very enthusiastically telling his seatmate about his new toy. Dave gave the final option to the stewardess on, "I can turn the plane around, or we can continue to our destination." And she opted to not make an undue fuss over the misunderstanding. Story 76. While boarding, there was a guy in his 20s sitting next to a solo mom with an infant. Infant is crying. Guy loudly asks her, "Can you shut that ducking thing up?" There was a gasp in unison of every mother within 5 rows forward and back. A FA was within earshot and immediately intervened by removing him and finding someone willing to switch seats with him. Story 77. I was on a flight from Pescortnix back home to Miami. I noticed the woman sitting next to me had nothing on her, just clutching a very small bag. No luggage, no phone, nothing to read or watch. She just sat there looking straight ahead. When the drink cart passed, she had no idea what the flight attendants were asking. That's when I realized she did not speak English. I started chatting her up in Spanish. Turns out she had just spent the last 3 weeks escaping Cuba. She got in a boat in the dead of night to Guatemala and then had a series of coyotes smuggle her across Central America until she crossed the border Mexico into the U.S. She spent most days on foot, some in vehicles with only 2 opportunities to shower, clean herself, and barely any meals. She was going to meet up with her boyfriend who had already escaped to Miami years before. Successfully getting on the plane was the culmination of the journey for her. By the end of her story, she was in tears, and when we landed, I gave her a hug and wished her the best of luck. I hope she found here what she was looking for. Story 78. I was on a plane sitting next to a woman, somewhere in her 40s, a sweet lady. We talked the whole time. She FaceTimed her husband as soon as we landed. She told him, "I think I found our bull," and looked at me. I was 19. Story 79. On a particularly bumpy flight from Amsterdam to London, the pilot had to abort the first landing attempt because of strong crosswinds. The 2 English lads sitting next to me were convinced we were all going to die. The older Dutch gentleman behind me calls out to the stewardess, "Is this the pilot's first time flying?" Story 80. Was recently behind a pair of drunk parents and an 11 and 12-year-old son with headphones. They were connecting to a week-long reunion with her family, and I hope they survived it. She was telling him to just give her money and leave so he could go be with his young girls in Italy. 2 highlights were him pulling his son's headphones off and saying, "You need to hear this. I'm only with these girls because your mother stopped loving me, and they are better than she ever was." And her saying, "My dad keeps asking to kill you, and I'm going to tell him now is the time. No one will find you, and no one will even care except the girls you spend so much on." Story 81. I sat next to an older guy who went on about the prostitutes he used to sleep with in the countries he was going to and how great the young Asian wife he had was. Story 82. 2 teenage girls sitting across the aisle from me. Girl 1. "I love trips. We should take a road trip to Hawaii this summer." Girl 2. "You are such an idiot. You don't even have your driver's license yet." Story 83. Not sure if it counts as crazy, but I was on a Virgin Atlantic flight and was in upper class quite close to one of those internal phones they use. It was when they had a walk-up bar there too, and there was a somewhat drunk guy at it making a very bad attempt to pull the admittedly very attractive stewardess, as they were called then, running the bar. Another member of the cabin crew spotted it and walked over to phone near me and called the banana pit and said, "There's a lech at the bar. Can you shake the plane to get him back to his seat?" Sure enough, there was noticeable movement of the plane. Hardly a shake, and the seatbelt lights went on, followed by an announcement of turbulence and asking everyone to return to their seats. So if you have ever wondered if sometimes that convenient turbulence when things are getting busy is real, I can confirm that on at least one occasion, it definitely was not. Story 84. Flying from Luxembourg to London, we hadn't yet taken off and were waiting for a slot to land at Heathrow. Sorry, we've waited so long, we've got to go and top up the fuel tanks before we can take off. Story 85. 220 Sogrugsing strangers, M and F, sat behind me. She offered him a weed edible. They spent the next 3 hours talking about their sex lives, but more so hers. She's in the BDSM community, likes being tied up, has been to orgies, etc. She spent the last hour showing him photos of her tied up in various positions, to which he was getting more and more excited. At the end of the fight, he says, "So are we going to do this?" And off they go together. I'm pretty open, and it was one of the more interesting conversations I've overheard on a flight. I just wonder how their elderly seatmate fared the entire time. Story 86. Was on a flight to Costa Rica. My mom chatted up the man sitting in our row. He told us how he started a business down there for river whitewater rafting tours. He gave us his card and everything. Halfway through the flight, an acquaintance he knew stops and tells him, "Hey, buddy, wow, what a shame to hear about all those people who drowned and sustained injuries in your negligence lawsuit." Story 87. Sorry I'm late, but I have Sogrugsing for this. A 3-yo boy was sitting next to me with his father, asleep across the aisle from him. His ears had been causing him some discomfort during the climb. So, on the way back down, I asked him how he was feeling. He said he was fine and quietly to himself, but my banana hurts a little bit. Story 88. I was on a flight from TX to NJ and overheard a man crying a few rows behind me. He was in the last row. I figured he was just scared of flying or Sogrugsing, but once the plane was more full, he started screaming, "Captain! I need to speak with the captain," over and over again. At that point, it became clear to me that the man was handcuffed and flying with an officer. He was eventually taken off the plane for yelling, and the pilot apologized for the disturbance and explained the man was in the process of being deported. I felt pretty sad hearing his pleas, knowing he was being sent out of the country. Also was surprised to learn prisoners are sometimes flown on passenger planes like that. Story 89. I don't know about craziest, but one of the most interesting I heard was a Missouri Synod Lutheran minister. very conservative, having a religious discussions with a professor at an Episcopal, very liberal, seminary. They disagreed on almost everything, and as a religious nerd, I was entertained. Story 90. Not overheard, but experienced. An elderly lady once in her late 70s or early 80s sat next to me on an east to west coast flight. She was dressed very poorly and simply. First time flying as well. I helped calm her. During small talk, she told me she is flying to meet a dude she met online, who she has never met before. She had no money for a hotel, etc. If it didn't go well, or a safe plan and only her return ticket in 3 weeks. I was terrified for her. Story 91. Didn't hear but smell. There was a passenger ahead of us who kept passing radioactive farts. I never would believed in my life that people will survive after smelling them. That was a very awful flight. It was about 4 HRS or so Grugzing. We reached the hotel exhausted as hell from the toxic fumes he was passing. We could not go out. That day was a waste. Duck that man. Story 92. In mid-flight. From Baltimore to Atlanta. The lights in the cabin and the entertainment system, our Wi-Fi, had gone off about a minute before the announcement. Folks, this is the pilot speaking. We'd just lost generator power and we'll be making an emergency landing. We'll be on the ground in about 5 minutes. That was a little unnerving. Also, on a flight from San Diego to Minneapolis, shortly after takeoff. Folks, we have a medical emergency in the banana pit, and we're diverting to Lax, and we'll be on the ground shortly. Story 93. Sitting on the plane in Miami, waiting to go home from our vacation in 2021. Couple comes in obviously inebriated, and the flight attendant asks them to put their masks back on. Man makes a sexist comment about how flight attendant is cute and could put it back on for him. FA isn't having any of this, asks them one more time, and then walks away when they don't comply. Couple sits down and proceeds to have a speakerphone conversation with a roommate who ordered a taxi but doesn't have any money to pay. Girl says, "Is he white? Just offer him some coke or mushrooms. White people love those groogs." They continued to talk about the various forms of groogs they had around the house that roommate could use as payment for the taxi, right up until they were escorted off the plane for not following the mask mandate. Story 94. Seen and heard. Flying to TX Airport from Koei a couple weeks ago. Lady was blubbering about Sagrugsing under her breath during the plane taxiing to a runway. Keep saying she had to potty. As the plane is going up at that blunt takeoff angle, she decided that's the best time to unbuckle and dash to the bathroom. Somehow she makes it. Barely in there for a minute, and falls stumbles her way back to her seat. Then she's complaining about someone stealing her original seat, and she's gonna call their corporate and whatnot. It was a cluster duck. We make it to TX. As my family and I are looking for our connecting terminal, we pass her being escorted by security and police. I still have questions. Asterisk appreciate the upvotes. Story 95. My best mate and I were on our way back from Sydney, where his brother had been caught up in a pretty high-profile drug trafficking syndicate, and we went to support him in court. My best mate was pretty shattered and just wanted to talk about it. The lady next to us got a 1-hour podcast of the whole thing from smuggling, jail, bail, and court. Unsure if she was entertained or mortified. Story 96. 2 women in front of me discussing their niece, who had flown out to Paris to find a dress for her school formal, prom, from Australia. Then apparently the designer would be flying out to Australia for fittings and adjustments. Then proceeded to complain about kids these days being so wasteful with money and spending so much on a simple dress. Can confidently say that kids these days do not routinely fly halfway across the world for a couture dress, then fly the designer halfway across the world for a school dance. Story 97. My ex proposed me on a flight. They announced it on the speakers that the guy on seat number this has Sagrugsing important to ask the lady on seat number that. He kneeled down, ring box in his hands, probably saying some romantic stuff that I can't hear because of the loud engines. He popped the question, and I'm still staring at his face. He then impatiently said, "Say yes?" And I replied, "Well, we'll see." Nobody heard anything. Then people started applauding. Ring on my finger, tears of happiness, and all that jazz. He breaks up with me the very next day. Story 98. I was flying from ATL to MSP one time when I listened to someone nag their traveling partner to go up to first class and one by one ask all the rich people if they would switch with her, because her feet hurt. So he didn't even acknowledge her presence for the whole flight, and she just kept dropping hint after hint that he should be providing her a more comfortable flying experience. She even suggested that he could go make a new rich friend up in first class and then invite them back to coach to continue the conversation, so she could go take their seat. Story 99. I didn't overhear it. It was said directly to me. My seat neighbor spent most of the long haul tapping me to talk and went on long rants about her money chasing husband. At one point, she turned to me and said, "Do you think I should kill him?" Dead straight. I said, "I don't think that's a good idea." And she paused before moving on. The air hosts seemed to recognize her weirdness, and they began to pay extra attention to me, bringing me things from up front business class and interjecting whenever she was ranting on for too long. Story 100. Right after Epstein got arrested, I was flying back out of Miami And the two guys seated next to me were having a very promenade conversation about the age of consent. Hey man, everyone wants a young woman. I'm 55 and I'm chasing this 21-year-old at the office. Epstein just liked him real young. What's so wrong with that? I hear you, man. I mean, crap. I saw one chick in the airport, man, smoking hot. Turns out she was 17. Could have fooled me. But hey, what would be the problem? If I ask her and she says, yeah, it ain't like I reaped her or nothing, ducking vomit. Story 101, just flew to Vegas not too long ago. And the guy next to me was on the phone with a friend, talking openly and loudly about how he's done fighting for his loveless marriage. I then saw him hop on his iPad to check out LV escort services. Story 102. I was 13 and some drunk guy kept trying to show me his cowboy boots he bought in Texas, Dallas Airport. Not on the plane, but while boarding. He apparently became disorderly inside the gateway before my group was boarding because some worker asked if I was with him. I said I don't even know him, and then he wasn't allowed to board the plane. Story 103. Not overheard, but saw. Dude was sitting in an aisle a few rows in front of me on the opposite side. He had his big-ass iPad out and was scrolling through Saugrousing. I guess he wanted to look at a picture in his gallery or Saugrousing. But what popped up, I will never forget. It was a full screen of a woman looking up at the camera between legs with a banana in her mouth. I can only presume it was that guy. He seemed surprised because he quickie closed it and then looked around like no one saw that, right? I did, my dude. I did. Story 104. I flew on 9/11 last year and was sat next to a Jewish family with two younger kids. Mid-flight, the one kid yells across the aisle to his mom and asks, "Mommy, are Arabs allowed to fly on planes?" It got real quiet after that. Story 105. Business flight across the US, so 5-ish hour long flight. Man and woman sitting behind me based on their conversation, also a business flight. Conversation started off benign enough, talking about their weekend plans with spouses and kids. Midway through the flight became flirtatious. By the end of the flight, they had mapped out every detail as to how they were going to cheat with each other regularly and keep it from their families. Definitely lost a part of my soul hearing that. Story 106. On a flight from London to Singapore, departing London around 11 p.m. About 6 hours into the flight, the lights which had been dimmed suddenly illuminated, klaxons sounded. And over the intercom came the announcement, "Grab an oxygen mask. If you are not in your seat, seat in the nearest available seat and grab an oxygen mask." The only oxygen mask was one which the cabin crew had released for an elderly, aisle passenger 2 rows behind me when he boarded. He had to have been exceedingly nervous at that point. Story 107. 2 elderly people in front of me talking on either side to this random person about fishing on a flight to Orlando from London. Plot twist. They were my grandparents. Story 108. Passed out soon as we took off. Woke up to turbulence and "This is your captain speaking. There's a warning light that's come on and we're not sure what it means. Gonna turn us around and have it looked at." Story 109. On a military flight. Leaving an overnight layover in another country. Pilots entering banana pit. "As long as we get this thing to 800 feet, we'll be fine." Context. We had an overnight layover and much partying happened. Didn't know that included flight crew. One of the loadmasters had to get a taxi because they missed the shuttle. He passed out and was hogtied by his crewmates. I guess 800 feet is where autopilot starts to take over. Story 110. Captain. "Well, we're running out of fuel, so we'll need to land at LaGuardia. But you can't deplane there since we don't have a ground crew at this time of day. So after refueling, we'll fly to JFK." And we did. 10-mile flight took 25 minutes, net 24 miles per hour on a jet, and an extra 90 minutes of travel time. Story 111. Definitely the girl who sat behind and described in vivid detail about the sex she had had that weekend. A foursome, a public blowjob, and a few others. My very conservative wife was even getting a little flustered by the story. Story 112. This is more funny than crazy. One time I had a bad conversation with United, yet again, where they couldn't be bothered to help me with my problem in any way, shape, or form, and basically told me to pound sand. As I walked away in my mind, I thought, "Ducking United." And at the exact same moment, a guy walked by me and said, "Ducking United." It made me laugh. Story 113. Had a guy ask the flight attendant if he could connect to his own Wi-Fi once in the air. He brought his own router and just wanted to make sure it was okay to use. The flight attendant froze and had no clue how to respond to his question. Story 114. Saw a Scouse guy lean over to a fella reading a newspaper on the other side as the aisle and say, "Give us a read of that when you're done with it." Newspaper man replies, "Nope, Scouse man, I'll ducking knock you out, blah, 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 plane." Hadn't even taxied to the runway. Somewhat awkward flight to Benidorm ensued. Story 115. I was flying on Southwest, and there was a flight attendant who had clearly had a bad day and wasn't about to take anyone's crap. Halfway through the flight, I heard a guy make a comment that could have been taken as a threat to this flight attendant over not getting a can of apple juice. When I got off the plane, there were 4 officers waiting to arrest him. Story 116. Not so crazy, but shout out to the girl I sat next to on the plane when traveling from the States to my study abroad in France. It was the first huge travel I did by myself, and I was crying. Undiagnosed anxiety, anyone? She turned to me and forced her chocolate chip cookies on me, talked to me, and helped me through it. I will never forget her kindness. Story 117. The guy sitting next to me continued to brag about his exploits as an IDF, Israeli Defense Force officer, and how efficient he was at doing his job. The implication of murder and genocide, all under his breath. He also bragged he was legally carrying a weapon on him too. Dude was an absolute psycho, and it took me the rest of the day for my blood pressure to come down. Story 118. Two men talking about shooting the pilot while still at the gate before taxi. Major alarms going off in my head until 12 seconds later, when context made it entirely clear they were TV producers. Story 119. I saw a couple in the airport saying goodbye. It was very dramatic. I sat next to her on the plane. She called him as soon as she sat down, and he proceeded to break up with her on the phone. She cried the whole trip. I tried to ask if she was okay, but she wanted nothing to do with me. I felt bad. Story 120. I sat next to an older gentleman on a flight, 65 plus, spent a trip from Seattle to St. Louis on Backpages.com looking for an escort when we landed. At one point, he poked me to ask my opinion. I declined. Story 121. I was on a plane sitting next to a life coach. We talked the entire flight. It was a great conversation until we were landing. As we heard the wheels come out and we started to descend, he asked me, "Do you believe in God?" And I instantly thought, bro, why the duck would you ask that question at this very moment? The person in front of us started to hyperventilate. Story 122. I was flying for my honeymoon last year and overheard another couple talking about what they expected to happen and they were going to be a part of Down in Doctor. Story 123. I'd like your definition of crazy, but a guy I sat next to on a 9-hour flight to Germany listened to Chasing Cars by Snow Patrol, basically the whole time. The TV at his seat was broken, so he got complimentary drinks and was just vibing to that one dang song with his headphones. Story 124. I was on a plane the day Mash 370 went missing, and the people sitting directly behind me wouldn't stop talking about it, making all the other passengers super anxious. Story 125. Was going to Orlando to stay with my cousin for a week, and was stuck sitting next to an old couple who were weirdly excited by the fact that we had no Wi-Fi. Oh yay, no Wi-Fi. Kids today and their technology, and then she spent the whole flight on her phone. Story 126. Flight into Salt Lake City. Heard the guy across the aisle from me thank someone for their service. Glance up, expecting to see a military uniform or veteran's hat, so groogsing like that. Nope, Mormon missionary. Seems they take that stuff really serious. Story 127. Not overheard, but overlooked. I was sitting next to a lady once and had a sneaky glance to see what she was reading, as one does when their next-door neighbor is watching or reading anything. Turned out it was hardcore fantasy erotica. Story 128. Say in ye asterisk whispered into their cell phone before a 12-hour flight to Italy. Mark and I just tested positive, but we can't cancel. No, we're already on the plane.